3 months after selling our house in Kelowna and moving to Vietnam, I booked a flight back to Canada. I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell my wife's sister who had warned us not to go. At that point, I was convinced we had made the worst decision of our lives. The house was gone. The truck was gone. The furniture, the tools, the hockey gear I'd held onto for 20 years, all of it was gone. Everything we couldn't pack into 4 suitcases had been sold or donated or left on the curb. There was no house waiting for us in Kelowna, no garage, no backup plan, and I wasn't sure anymore where any of that left us. What happened in the weeks after I booked that flight is the only reason I'm telling this story today. My name is Gary. I was 63 years old when my wife Pauline and I made the move. We weren't wealthy. We weren't chasing some dream of sipping cocktails on a beach. We were retired, living on our CPP, a small pension from the school board, where Pauline had worked for 28 years and about $280,000 from selling our home. From the outside, our life probably looked fine, and in a lot of ways it was. But every year, groceries cost a little more. Every year, the property taxes crept up. Every year we had another conversation that started with, "We really should think about the future," and ended with us changing the subject because the future felt expensive in a way we couldn't fully talk about without getting anxious. The idea of Vietnam started the way a lot of ideas start in retirement. Boredom and YouTube. One evening in January, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of tea, and I stumbled onto a video of a Canadian couple in their 60s walking through a morning market in Hoi An. They were buying vegetables for what sounded like almost nothing. They looked comfortable. They looked relaxed. They didn't look like people who checked their bank balance before agreeing to go out for dinner. Watched that video 3 times. Then I watched 6 more. Then I started looking at numbers. Then I started making spreadsheets. The more I looked into it, the more it seemed like something we could actually do. Not perfectly, not without risk, but possible. And possible felt like more than we'd had in a while. Pauline took more convincing than I did. She's practical in ways that I'm not. She asked the questions I was too excited to ask. What about healthcare? What about the language? What about our grandson's birthday in October? What about her garden? I didn't have great answers for any of it. What I kept coming back to was that if we didn't try this now, at 63 and 61, with our health still good and nothing tying us to any particular place, we might spend the next decade wondering what would have happened if we had. It took about 6 months of research before we made a decision. By that point, I had joined 4 different expat forums, read every blog I could find about retiring in Southeast Asia, and talked to 2 couples we'd found online who had made similar moves. One of them had been in Da Nang for 3 years. The other had tried Chiang Mai, then Hoi An, and eventually settled outside of Hue. Both of them said the same thing. It's not for everyone. But if you can get through the first few months, it changes how you see everything. We listed the house in March. It sold in 11 days. After that moved faster than I expected. The truck went to a neighbor's son who had just gotten his license. The furniture went to a consignment shop downtown and then, whatever they didn't take, to the Salvation Army. I spent 2 weekends going through the garage, tools I'd had since my 30s, boxes of things that belonged to my parents, a set of golf clubs I hadn't touched in 4 years. Some of it was easy to let go. Some of it wasn't. One afternoon I was sorting through a box in the back of the closet and found a stack of birthday cards our daughter Melissa had made when she was little. Crayon drawings of our house. Of the backyard. One that said, "Best Dad in the whole wide universe." The spelling was her own. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time with those cards in my hands. For the first time since we'd decided to go, I wondered if we were doing the right thing. Melissa hadn't tried to talk us out of it. She'd asked careful questions and offered practical help and told us she thought it was brave. But I could hear something underneath all of that, a worry she wasn't saying out loud. She had a son, our grandson Theo, who had just turned 4 And I think what she was really asking, without asking it, was how far away are you going to be? A few days before our flight, the house was empty. We had a single air mattress on the floor of the bedroom. Our 4 suitcases were lined up against the wall. I walked through every room that night after Pauline had fallen asleep, just looking at things. The nail holes where pictures had hung. The window in the kitchen where we used to watch the deer come down from the hill in November. The scuff on the baseboard in the hallway that had been there since the year our son came home from university with a bicycle and no plan for where to put it. I sat down in the middle of the empty living room and thought, what if we're wrong about this? The thought kept me awake until almost 3 in the morning. By then, there was nothing to turn back to. We flew out of Kelowna to Vancouver, then Vancouver to Seoul, then Seoul to Da Nang. 22 hours of travel, not counting the layovers. By the time we landed, it was already the next day, and neither of us was sure what day that was. The heat hit us the moment we walked out of the airport. Not the dry Okanagan heat I was used to. Something heavier, something that got into your shirt immediately and stayed there. Before leaving Canada, we had arranged a furnished apartment in the Unthong neighborhood, close to the beach, close to restaurants, close enough to a market that Pauline could walk there in the mornings. We had paid 3 months in advance. The place was simple. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony, tiled floors that stayed cool even in the afternoon. It was nothing like our house in Kelowna. But it was ours for now, and that night we ate at a plastic table on the sidewalk, outside a restaurant we'd never been to, and ordered by pointing at things and ended up with 2 bowls of something that tasted better than anything we'd had in months. For the first few weeks, Vietnam felt like the beginning of something. Every morning was different. We walked along the Han River in the early hours when it was still cool. We found a coffee shop on a side street where the owners spoke a little English and started to recognize us after the 3rd visit. We rented bicycles and got lost twice, and found a market we never would have found otherwise. We met other expats, a couple from Vancouver who had been there 2 years, a man from Quebec who had come alone after a divorce and seemed happier than anyone had a right to be, a retired teacher from Edmonton who was learning Vietnamese with a tutor 3 times a week. Everything still had that quality of being temporary. Interesting. Worth noticing, the little frustrations. The internet cutting out, the traffic on the main road, the hours of operation that seemed to change every other day. None of it bothered us much. We were still tourists in our own heads, still seeing everything with that first trip kind of attention that makes even ordinary things feel significant. The problem was that we weren't tourists. We lived there, and somewhere around the 6th week, the difference between those 2 things started to become clear to me. The excitement didn't disappear, but it got quieter. The novelty started to wear thin at the edges. I found myself checking the CBC website in the mornings before I'd done anything else. I started having long phone calls with our son Kevin, not because anything was wrong, but because I needed to hear a familiar voice. I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The noise from the street that started at 5:30 in the morning and didn't stop. The way certain foods I'd been eating happily for weeks suddenly felt like they were sitting wrong. The fact that I couldn't read anything around me, and that the inability to read a sign or a menu or a package without help hadn't bothered me at first, but now, 2 months in, sometimes made me feel like I was walking through a world I wasn't part of. One afternoon, I caught myself on the balcony looking at photos of the house in Kelowna on my phone. Not because I missed the house, because I missed what it represented. The ease of it, the way I'd known where everything was, known what the weather would do in the morning, known the names of the people at the pharmacy and the hardware store and the coffee shop on Harvey Avenue. That was the first time I felt it properly. Homesickness. Not for a place exactly. For being known. For being somewhere that made sense without effort. I didn't say much to Pauline about it at first. She was adjusting differently than I was. She'd made a friend, a woman named Anne from New Zealand, who lived 2 floors below us. and had been in Da Nang for 18 months, and the two of them had started going to the market together 3 mornings a week. She seemed more settled than I felt. I didn't want to be the one who made her question everything, so I kept most of it to myself, and it grew. By the 3rd month, I wasn't just feeling homesick once in a while. I was thinking about Canada every day. Not all day, but enough. A news story about the Okanagan wildfire season. A photo Melissa sent of Theo at his first day of preschool, standing at the door with his backpack on, looking so much older than he had 3 months ago. I hadn't been there for that. I looked at that photo for a long time. A few days later, Kevin called to tell me he and his wife were expecting their first, a baby that would arrive in March. I was going to be a grandfather for the 2nd time, and I was on the other side of the planet. I hung up the phone and went out to sit on the balcony by myself. The street below was loud with scooters and the smell of something being grilled. It was a beautiful evening in its own way, but I felt very far from where I was supposed to be. That night I started doing something I hadn't done since we'd arrived. I started looking at flights, just to see, just to know what it would cost. Then I looked at rental listings in Kelowna, then Penticton, then Oliver, where things were a bit cheaper. Then I looked at flights again. The thing that scared me wasn't that I was looking. The thing that scared me was how good it felt to look, like I was finding a door I'd thought was locked. A few nights after that, I opened the Air Canada website and I booked a flight. 2 seats. Me and Pauline 3 weeks out. I stared at the confirmation screen for a long time afterward. Part of me felt like I'd finally exhaled. Part of me felt like I'd failed at something I'd spent 2 years building toward. I didn't tell Pauline that night. I told myself I'd bring it up in the morning, that I'd explain everything then, that we'd talk it through and she would understand because she'd probably been feeling the same way. The morning came and I didn't say anything. Then another day passed. And another. I had a return flight booked and I was carrying it around like a secret. What I told myself was, I'll tell her when it gets closer, when the time feels right. What I was really doing was testing whether it felt right to go back. And the strange thing was that the closer that flight got, the less certain I was. I wasn't looking forward to going home. I was just tired of feeling like I didn't belong where I was. And I was starting to understand, slowly, not all at once, that those aren't the same thing. The day everything shifted, I wasn't looking for it to shift. I had gone for a walk along the beach in the early morning, before Pauline was up, before the beach got crowded. I'd been walking that stretch for 3 months, but that morning everything felt heavier than usual. The flight was 2 weeks away. I was going to have to tell Pauline soon. I was going to have to explain that I'd booked it without asking her, that I'd been carrying this around, that I wasn't sure anymore whether we'd made the right call. I turned off the beach and onto a side street I didn't usually take, heading back toward the apartment, and I passed a small cafe I'd been to a few times before. Sitting outside at one of the low tables was a man I recognized, Doug, a retired contractor from Manitoba who had moved to Da Nang about 4 years earlier. We'd talked a few times at an expat meetup, nothing more than casual conversation. He waved me over. He asked how things were going. And I don't know why. Maybe because I was tired of carrying it. Maybe because he was far enough outside my actual life that it didn't feel like a risk. I told him the truth. I told him I'd booked a flight back to Canada. I told him I hadn't told my wife yet. I told him I wasn't sure this had been the right decision and that I was starting to think we'd made a very expensive, very permanent mistake. He listened. He didn't look surprised. Then he asked me a question I wasn't expecting. He asked how long we'd been planning the move before we came. About 1.5 years, I said. Maybe closer to 2. Research, forums, spreadsheets, phone calls with people who'd done it. He nodded. Then he asked how long we'd actually been in Vietnam. 3 months, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "You spent 2 years preparing for something, and you're willing to let 3 months be the final word on it." I didn't say anything. He picked up his coffee and leaned back, and said that his own first 6 months had been the worst of it. He said he'd gone home to Winnipeg twice in that first year, once with a reason, once without one. He said both times he'd come back to Vietnam, not because Vietnam was perfect, but because going back to what he knew hadn't solved anything either. It had just traded one kind of discomfort for another. Then he said something that I've repeated to myself more times than I can count. He said, "The hardest part of building a new life is staying in it long enough to find out if it actually becomes one." We sat there for maybe 40 minutes. I drank 2 coffees. By the time I left, nothing had been decided. But something had shifted. Because I realized that what I'd been planning to do, book a flight without telling Pauline, cancel a life we'd spent 2 years building, go back to a city where we no longer owned a house, wasn't a plan. It was an escape route, and those aren't the same thing. That evening I told Pauline about the flight. She was quieter than I expected. She didn't get angry. She sat with it for a moment, and then she said she'd had her own version of the same feeling just a few weeks earlier. She'd almost called Melissa to say they needed to come back. She hadn't because she wasn't sure. She was still not sure, but she hadn't booked anything. We talked for a long time that night. Not about Vietnam, really. About what we'd actually been afraid of this whole time, which wasn't traffic or heat or the language barrier. It was the possibility that we'd spent everything, the money, the years, the familiar life, on something that didn't work out. In the end, we didn't cancel the flight right away. We sat with it for a few more days. And then I called the airline. We'd booked through a travel agent back in Canada before leaving, and she'd added cancellation coverage as a matter of course. Something I'd called a waste of money at the time. Most of the cost came back. The flight was gone. We gave ourselves 90 more days. That was the agreement. Not forever, not another year. 90 days. And at the end of it, we'd make a real decision, not a scared one. That was the turning point, though I didn't feel it turn right away. What changed first was small. I stopped checking the CBC every morning. Not on purpose. I just started spending that time differently. I started going to a coffee shop on the street behind our building most mornings. The one where the owner had started calling me by name, even though he was working from a phonetic approximation that didn't quite match. I started recognizing the woman who sold banh mi from a cart near the market entrance, and she started holding one aside for me on the days I came by after 9. Pauline's friendship with Anne deepened, and she started coming home from their mornings out with small things. A jar of something local she'd learned to cook with, a phrase she'd picked up, an invitation to a cooking class 2 streets over. The place started to feel less like a test and more like a Tuesday. One morning, I realized I hadn't thought about Kelowna in 4 days. Then it was a week. The feeling that I was waiting to find out if this was real, that feeling started to quiet down. There were still hard days. There was a week in October when Theo got sick enough that Melissa had to take him to the hospital, and I was here, 12 time zones away, texting from a cafe in the middle of the afternoon while she was sitting in a waiting room at 3 in the morning. He was fine, but I sat with that for a while. I don't think that particular kind of distance ever completely stops hurting. What changed was that I stopped using the distance as evidence against the decision. It was just something that was true, the way a lot of things in a life are true. This is hard, and I'm still here, and hard and wrong are not the same thing. Kevin and his wife Sophie came to visit us in February, about 2 months before the baby was due. They stayed for 10 days. We showed them everything we'd found over the previous 7 months. The coffee shop, the market, the restaurant where we'd had that first meal, the stretch of beach where I walked in the early mornings. On their last night, Kevin said something that surprised me. He said he'd been worried about us at first, but that he wasn't anymore. He said we seemed like ourselves again. Like we'd remembered something. I've thought about what he meant by that a lot since he said it. I think what Pauline and I had lost somewhere in our last few years in Kelowna wasn't the house or the truck or the familiarity of the neighborhood. What we'd lost was the sense that we were still doing something with whatever time was left. Not surviving it, not managing it, actually doing something with it. The move hadn't given us an easy life. Vietnam is not easy in ways that Canada never isn't. Things break and can't be fixed quickly. Things are confusing in ways that can't always be explained. There are days when I feel like a person trying to live inside a language I'll never fully speak, in a place that makes complete sense to everyone around me and partial sense to me on a good day. But I stopped comparing every day to what life would have looked like if we'd stayed. And when I stopped doing that, things got better. Not perfect, just better. And better turned out to be enough. Today, I still have days when I miss the Okanagan in September, when the air smells like pine and the lake is still warm enough to swim. I still have days when I wish I could drive over to Melissa's and sit in her backyard and watch Theo dig in the dirt. I still have moments when I wonder what we would have done if we'd just kept the house, paid down the mortgage another few years, stayed where we were known. But I don't regret leaving. Not anymore. And the night I almost flew back. That night I almost traded everything we'd built for the comfort of going back to something that no longer existed the way I remembered it. I'm glad I didn't get on that plane, because I know myself well enough to know what would have happened. I would have landed in Vancouver. I would have found somewhere to stay. And Pauline would have found a way to make it work. And slowly we would have rebuilt something ordinary and fine. And I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what the next 90 days would have looked like if we'd stayed. If you're thinking about doing something like this, selling the house, leaving the place you've lived for 20 years, starting over in your 60s in somewhere you've never fully understood, here's the only thing I'd tell you. Give it more time than feels reasonable. A new place won't feel like home in 3 months. It might not feel like home in 6. There will be mornings when you wake up, and the gap between where you are and where you know how to be will feel impossible to cross. That's not a sign you made the wrong choice. That's just what it feels like to be somewhere new in a body that spent 6 decades learning a different world. The hardest part isn't finding the apartment or learning the buses or figuring out where to buy things. The hardest part is staying long enough to find out who you become after the hard part. 3 months after we arrived in Vietnam, I was certain we'd made the biggest mistake of our lives. Now I'm not certain of that at all. And the difference between those two things, that's the whole story.